In 1961, the last commercial gold mine in the Cripple Creek Mining District shut its doors for good. The Carlton mill processed its final batch of ore, the pumps went silent, and the water began to rise. Thousands of feet of underground tunnels, some of the deepest and most productive gold shafts ever sunk on the North American continent, were abandoned and left to flood. The official story is simple. Gold mining at Cripple Creek became too expensive. Labor costs rose. The price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce by the federal government, and you just couldn't turn a profit anymore. Case closed. Economics killed Cripple Creek. But here's what that story conveniently leaves out. Cripple Creek wasn't just any gold district. Between 1891 and the early 1960s, this single volcanic basin on the western slope of Pikes Peak produced over 21 million ounces of gold. At today's prices, that's somewhere north of $50 billion. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It was pulled out of a 6-square-mile patch of Colorado mountainside. And the geologists who studied the district before the closures weren't saying the gold was running out. They were saying the opposite. The deeper shafts were hitting richer veins. The ore grades at the lowest levels of mines like the Cresson, the Portland, and the Ajax were among the highest ever recorded in the district's history. So why do you walk away from that? Why do you flood shafts that are producing better ore than they did 20 years earlier? Why does the richest gold district in the American West go dark at the exact moment its deepest mines are hitting their stride? The answer isn't about cost. It never was. And to understand what really happened at Cripple Creek, you have to look at a sequence of federal decisions, financial maneuvers, and regulatory pressures that make no sense if the goal was simply managing an unprofitable industry, but they make perfect sense if the goal was something else entirely. Let's go back to the beginning. The Cripple Creek Mining District sits inside an ancient volcanic caldera on the southwest side of Pikes Peak, about 20 miles west of Colorado Springs. The geology is unusual. Unlike most gold deposits in the Rocky Mountain region, which formed in quartz veins running through granite, the gold at Cripple Creek is hosted in volcanic breccia and phonolite, deposited by hydrothermal fluids that moved through fracture systems in the ancient volcano. The result is a deposit that doesn't behave like a normal vein mine. The gold isn't in neat, predictable ribbons you can follow laterally. It's distributed through a massive three-dimensional network of fractures, and the deeper you go, the more of those fracture systems you intersect. Robert Womack is credited with the first major discovery in 1890. He found float gold in a creek bed on the south side of the caldera, and within months prospectors were pouring in from every direction. By 1893 the district had exploded. Towns like Victor, Goldfield, Independence, Altman, and Cripple Creek itself sprang up across the basin. The population hit 50,000. The mines went deeper every year. But what made Cripple Creek different from Leadville or Aspen or any of the other Colorado boom towns wasn't just the quantity of gold. It was the persistence of the deposit. Most mining districts in the West follow a predictable arc. There's a surface discovery, a rush, a few years of bonanza production, and then the easy ore runs out. The deeper you go, the more it costs, and eventually the margins disappear. Cripple Creek broke that pattern completely. The deeper the miners went, the richer the ore became. The Cresson mine, operated by the Portland Gold Mining Company, hit one of the most spectacular ore bodies ever found in the Western Hemisphere in 1914, more than 1,000 feet below the surface. Miners broke into a vug, a crystal-lined cavity in the rock that was literally wallpapered with gold. They pulled over $1 million in gold out of a single room-sized pocket, and that was at 1914 prices. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere around $30 million from one hole in the rock. And the Cresson vug wasn't unique. It was just the most dramatic example of a pattern the geologists had been documenting for years. The gold concentration increased with depth. The fracture systems that hosted the ore became more numerous and more interconnected the further down you went. Every geological report filed with the Colorado Bureau of Mines between 1910 and 1940 confirmed the same thing. The district had been barely scratched. The geology explains why. Cripple Creek's gold was deposited by superheated fluids rising through fractures in the volcanic rock. Those fluids came from deep magmatic sources, and they deposited gold as they cooled and reacted with the surrounding rock. The further down you go, the closer you get to the source, and the more concentrated the mineralization becomes. It's the opposite of what you see in most surface-enriched deposits, where the richest material is near the top and fades with depth. At Cripple Creek, depth was your friend. Every foot deeper was a foot closer to the engine that created the gold in the first place. The miners knew this, the geologists knew this, the mine operators published reports and investment prospectuses that explicitly described the increasing ore grades at depth. This wasn't speculative geology. It was documented, measured, assayed, and published in government reports that anyone could read. And yet, when the story of Cripple Creek gets told in mainstream histories, this detail somehow gets left on the cutting room floor. You hear about the decline, you hear about the economics, you don't hear about the ore grades at the bottom of the Portland shaft. So here's the first question you have to sit with. If you're the federal government and you've got a district that's produced 21 million ounces of gold, and the geologists are telling you there's potentially that much again sitting below the existing workings, why would you let that go? The standard answer is Executive Order 6102. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed an order requiring all persons to deliver their gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. Private gold ownership was effectively criminalized. The price of gold was then fixed at $35 per ounce, and it stayed there for nearly 4 decades. Now, the conventional interpretation is that this killed mining. Fixed price, rising costs, shrinking margins, simple math. And on the surface, that math checks out. Labour costs did rise, equipment costs went up. The war years pulled workers out of the mines and into defence industries. All of that is true. But here's what the conventional story glosses over. The government didn't just fix the price, they fixed the price while simultaneously taking control of the entire gold supply chain. After 1933, you couldn't sell your gold to anyone except the United States government. The mint was the only legal buyer, which means the government wasn't just setting the price. They were the market. They were the only customer. And any mine that operated in the United States after 1933 was, in practical terms, a captive supplier to a single monopoly buyer who also controlled the price. Think about what that means for Cripple Creek specifically. You've got a district producing high-grade ore from increasingly productive deep mines, but the only entity allowed to buy your gold is the same entity that decided your gold is worth $35 an ounce, regardless of what the actual market would pay. And that entity also controls your labour regulations, your safety standards, your tax rates, and your mineral rights. This isn't a free market failing. This is a controlled market being squeezed. And the squeeze got tighter during World War II. In 1942, the War Production Board issued Order L208, which classified gold mining as non-essential to the war effort and ordered the closure of gold mines across the country. The stated reason was to redirect labour and equipment to copper, lead, zinc, and other metals needed for military production. Over 1,000 gold mines were shut down nationwide, including most of the remaining operations at Cripple Creek. Now, on the surface, L208 makes sense as a wartime measure. You need copper for shell casings and zinc for galvanizing steel. Fair enough. But look at what happened after the war. When the fighting ended in 1945, you'd expect those gold mines to reopen. The wartime emergency was over. The labour was available again. The equipment could be redirected back, but most of them never reopened. At Cripple Creek, only a handful of operations resumed after the war, and they operated at reduced capacity. The pumps that kept the deep mines dry had been shut off during the closure, and water had flooded the lower levels. Dewatering a mine that's been flooded for 3 years is enormously expensive, and with gold still fixed at $35 an ounce, the economics were brutal, and this is a point that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The flooding wasn't accidental, it wasn't an unexpected consequence. Every mining engineer in the country knew that if you turned off the pumps in a deep mine, water would fill the workings. The Cripple Creek District sits in a volcanic basin with significant groundwater flow. The mines had always required constant pumping to keep them operational. Turning off those pumps was the equivalent of pulling the plug on the entire district, and everyone involved in the decision knew exactly what would happen. So when the War Production Board issued L208, they weren't just temporarily shutting down gold mines. They were creating a situation where reopening those mines would require a massive capital investment that no private company could afford at the government's fixed gold price. It was a 1-2 punch. First, force the closure, then make the cost of reopening so high that it becomes effectively permanent. And all of it dressed up as a wartime necessity that nobody could argue against without looking unpatriotic. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The cost of dewatering those mines wasn't some unknowable figure. The Carlton Tunnel, a drainage and transportation tunnel that ran from the district to the Carlton Mill in the town of Cripple Creek, had been engineered specifically to manage water in the deep mines. The infrastructure existed, the technology existed, the ore was still there, and everyone knew it was there. What didn't exist was the political will to reopen them. And this is the part of the story that most histories of Cripple Creek just skip over. Between 1946 and 1961, the federal government received multiple proposals to subsidize gold mining at Cripple Creek. Mine operators, the Colorado state government, and even some members of Congress argued that the district's gold reserves were a strategic national asset and that the government should provide assistance to restart deep mining operations. These weren't fringe proposals. They were backed by geological surveys, engineering studies, and detailed cost analyses. Every single one was rejected. Now compare that to what the government was doing with other strategic minerals during the same period. Uranium mining received massive federal subsidies through the Atomic Energy Commission. The government built roads, provided guaranteed purchase prices, and even offered bonuses for discovery. Copper, lead, and zinc producers received tax incentives and strategic stockpile purchases. The Defense Production Act of 1950 authorized loans, price supports, and purchase agreements for dozens of commodities the government deemed essential. Gold wasn't on the list. Think about that for a moment. The metal that literally backed the nation's currency wasn't considered strategic enough to warrant the same support that was being given to vanadium and beryllium. The metal sitting in the vaults at Fort Knox as the foundation of the entire Bretton Woods monetary system wasn't worth keeping the mines open, unless keeping those mines open was never the objective. Here's the alternative reading of what happened at Cripple Creek, and this is where the standard economic narrative completely falls apart. The closure of the deep mines wasn't a passive consequence of unfavorable economics. It was the desired outcome of a deliberate policy. The fixed gold price, the wartime closure order, the refusal to subsidize post-war reopening, and the eventual abandonment of the district all served the same purpose. They eliminated domestic gold production at the exact moment the federal government was consolidating total control over the nation's gold reserves. And the timing of that consolidation lines up with something much bigger than Cripple Creek. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Under Bretton Woods, foreign governments could exchange their dollars for gold at any time. The system worked as long as the United States maintained enough gold reserves to back the dollars in circulation. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. But here's the problem. The amount of dollars in circulation was growing much faster than the gold reserves. The Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the Cold War build-up, all of these required enormous government spending, which meant printing more dollars, which meant the ratio of dollars to gold kept getting worse. If domestic gold production had continued at scale, it would have complicated the monetary strategy in ways that most economists don't like to talk about. Active domestic mines meant gold was flowing into the system through production, not just sitting in vaults. That created transparency. It created an independent source of supply that the government couldn't fully control. It meant there were miners, geologists, and engineers who understood exactly how much gold was in the ground and could raise uncomfortable questions about whether the official reserves matched the official claims. Shutting down domestic production eliminated that transparency. Once the mines closed, the only gold in the system was the gold already in government vaults. And the only people who knew how much was really there were the people who controlled the vaults. The Carlton Tunnel at Cripple Creek tells this story in miniature. The tunnel was a marvel of mining engineering, over 6 miles long, driven through solid rock at a grade that allowed both drainage and ore transport. It connected the deep mines of the district to the processing mill and provided the critical infrastructure that made deep mining economically viable. When the tunnel stopped operating, the deep mines flooded. And once they flooded, the cost of reopening them became prohibitive without government assistance, which the government refused to provide. The infrastructure wasn't destroyed, it was rendered useless by neglect. And the timing of that neglect happens to coincide perfectly with the period when the US government needed domestic gold production to disappear. Let's talk about what was actually in the ground at Cripple Creek when the mines closed. The United States Geological Survey published a comprehensive study of the Cripple Creek District in 1935. The report, authored by geologists who had spent years mapping the underground workings, estimated that the district's known and inferred gold reserves extended well below the deepest existing mines. The fracture-hosted deposit system that produced the gold showed no signs of diminishing at depth. If anything, the geological evidence suggested that the richest zones hadn't been reached yet. Mining engineers who worked the district in the 1940s and 1950s corroborated this assessment. The ore grades in the lowest levels of the active mines were consistently higher than the ore grades at shallower levels. The Portland mine, which operated the deepest workings in the district, was reporting ore grades that would have been considered spectacular by any standard anywhere in the world. But none of this mattered if you couldn't sell your gold for more than $35 an ounce to the only buyer who was legally allowed to purchase it. There's a phrase that gets used a lot in mining: the best deposit in the world is worthless if you can't mine it profitably. And that's true in a free market. But Cripple Creek wasn't operating in a free market. It was operating in a market where the price was fixed by government decree, the buyer was a government monopoly, and the regulatory environment was controlled by the same government that was fixing the price. That's not a market failure, that's a market that's been designed to produce a specific outcome. And the outcome was the closure of the most productive gold district in North America. Now, here's where the Tartaria angle comes in. And I want to be careful here because this isn't about fantasy or speculation for its own sake. It's about asking why certain historical facts get scrubbed from the mainstream narrative while others get amplified. When you look at photographs of the Cripple Creek Mining District from the 1890s and early 1900s, some things don't add up. The scale of the infrastructure is staggering. We're talking about a district that went from nothing to 50,000 people in 3 years, with paved streets, electric trolleys, telephone systems, an opera house, and dozens of mines operating at depths that required sophisticated ventilation, pumping, and hoisting systems. The standard story is that all of this was built from scratch by prospectors and miners who showed up with picks and shovels, and maybe some of it was. But the Carlton Tunnel alone, 6 miles of precision-engineered underground excavation through volcanic rock, raises questions about the available technology and labour resources. The tunnel was completed in a time frame and at a cost that seems remarkably efficient for the era. This isn't unique to Cripple Creek, of course. You see similar patterns at mining districts across the American West. Comstock Lode in Nevada, Butte in Montana, Leadville in Colorado. Massive infrastructure appearing in remote locations with suspicious speed, being exploited intensively for a few decades and then being abandoned and erased from the landscape. The pattern is extraction followed by erasure. And at Cripple Creek, the erasure was particularly thorough. After the mines closed, the district experienced a systematic dismantling. Headframes were torn down, mills were demolished, company records were dispersed or destroyed. The town of Victor, which had been the center of mining operations, shrank from a bustling city to a near ghost town. The underground workings, which represented billions of dollars in engineering and excavation, were left to flood and collapse. What's remarkable about this dismantling is how quickly it happened and how complete it was. Within a decade of the last mine closing, most of the physical evidence of Cripple Creek's deep mining operations had been removed from the surface. Visitors driving through the district in the 1970s would have seen rolling hills, abandoned buildings, and a few rusting headframes. Nothing about the landscape communicated the scale of what had been built there, or the wealth that had been extracted from beneath it. And this matters because physical evidence is how communities maintain institutional memory. When the headframes come down and the mills are demolished and the tunnels flood, the knowledge of what was underground begins to fade from public awareness. A generation passes and people forget that there were ever mines there at all. 2 generations pass and the whole district becomes a quaint tourist destination with a narrow gauge railroad and some gift shops selling polished quartz. The gold beneath the surface becomes an abstraction, a historical curiosity rather than a strategic reality. Today there's a surface mining operation at Cripple Creek run by Newmont Mining. They use open-pit cyanide heap leach methods to process low-grade ore from the upper portions of the deposit. It's profitable because the gold price is no longer fixed, and modern surface mining techniques have lower labor costs than underground mining. But here's what Newmont isn't doing. They aren't reopening the deep mines, they aren't dewatering the old workings. They aren't going after the high-grade ore that the geologists identified below the deepest existing tunnels. They're skimming the top of a deposit that everyone knows goes much, much deeper. The open pit operation literally sits on top of the old underground workings. Newmont's trucks drive across ground that covers some of the richest unmined gold in the Western Hemisphere. The company's own geological reports acknowledge the deep mineralization. Their engineers know the ore is there, and yet the business model is entirely focused on surface material that runs a fraction of a gram per ton, while high-grade underground ore sits untouched in flooded tunnels a few hundred feet below their truck tires. And nobody seems to be asking why. The deep gold at Cripple Creek represents one of the largest known undeveloped gold resources in North America. The geological evidence for its existence is overwhelming. The technology to access it exists. The gold price is high enough to make deep mining economically viable for the first time since the 1930s. But the deep mines stay flooded, the tunnels stay closed, and the official story remains that Cripple Creek was simply a victim of unfavorable economics. Let me take you through the timeline one more time, because when you lay it out sequentially, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. 1891 to 1933. Cripple Creek produces millions of ounces of gold under free market conditions. The district grows, the mines deepen, and the ore gets richer with depth. Production is transparent. Multiple competing companies operate independently. The gold supply chain is distributed and difficult to control. 1933, Executive Order 61-2, private gold ownership criminalized. Gold price fixed at $35 an ounce. Government becomes the sole legal buyer. Production continues, but the miners are now captive suppliers to a monopoly purchaser. 1934. The Gold Reserve Act transfers ownership of all monetary gold from the Federal Reserve Banks to the United States Treasury. The government's control over the gold supply is now absolute. 1942. War Production Board Order L208 closes gold mines nationwide. Cripple Creek's deep mines are shut down. Pumps are turned off. Water begins flooding the lower workings. 1945. War ends. Gold mines are permitted to reopen. But the deep mines at Cripple Creek are now flooded. Dewatering costs are prohibitive at $35 per ounce. Only a few shallow operations resume. 1946 to 1961. Multiple proposals to subsidize deep mining at Cripple Creek are rejected by the federal government. The district's deep gold reserves are effectively abandoned. 1961. Carlton Mill processes its last ore. Commercial mining at Cripple Creek ceases entirely. 1971. Nixon closes the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system. The dollar is no longer convertible to gold. The gold price is allowed to float for the first time since 1933. 1975. Private gold ownership is legalized again in the United States. 1976 to present. Gold price rises from $35 to over $2,000 per ounce. Surface mining resumes at Cripple Creek. But the deep mines, where the richest ore was found, remain sealed and flooded. Now look at that timeline and tell me this was about economics. The government fixed the price, criminalized private ownership, monopolized purchasing, shut the mines during a war, refused to help reopen them after the war, waited until the mines were permanently flooded, and then delinked the dollar from gold entirely. If your goal was to eliminate independent domestic gold production while maintaining total control over existing gold reserves, this is exactly the sequence of steps you'd take. The deep gold at Cripple Creek didn't become uneconomical. It became inconvenient. It represented a source of wealth and information that existed outside government control, and the policy decisions that led to its abandonment were consistent with a broader strategy of monetary consolidation that played out over 4 decades. There's a geologist named Richard Goldfarb who published extensive work on the Cripple Creek deposit in the 1990s and 2000s. His research confirmed what the earlier surveys had suggested. The gold mineralization at Cripple Creek extends to depths well below the historic mining levels. The volcanic caldera that hosts the deposit is a massive hydrothermal system, and the fracture networks that carry the gold mineralization show no evidence of pinching out at the depths that were reached by the deepest mines. In plain language, there's gold down there that nobody has touched. Potentially a lot of it. And yet, in all the discussions about American gold reserves, strategic mineral policy, and energy independence, you almost never hear anyone mention reopening the deep mines at Cripple Creek. The conversation simply doesn't happen. The district has been quietly removed from the strategic calculus, as if the gold beneath it ceased to exist the moment the pumps were turned off. This is the real story of Cripple Creek, not a tale of economic decline and market forces, but a case study in how a government can use price controls, regulatory power, and strategic neglect to shut down a productive industry when that industry's continued operation conflicts with broader policy objectives. The gold is still there. The volcanic rock beneath Pikes Peak still holds millions of ounces of unmined gold in fracture systems that have never been explored. The Carlton Tunnel still exists, flooded and silent, a 6-mile monument to the infrastructure that once made deep mining possible. And the question that nobody in the mainstream wants to touch is simple. If the gold is still there and the technology to reach it exists, and the price is high enough to make it profitable, then why isn't anyone going after it? Maybe the answer is that someone decided a long time ago that it was better for that gold to stay in the ground, better for the monetary system, better for the institutions that control the currency, better for a financial architecture that depends on managing the supply of gold rather than producing it. Cripple Creek didn't die because the gold ran out. It didn't die because mining became unprofitable. It died because someone decided it needed to die. And the tools they used to kill it, price controls, wartime closure orders, regulatory neglect, and the refusal to subsidize strategic mineral production, are the same tools that get used every time an independent source of wealth threatens a centralized system. The mines are flooded, the records are scattered, the towns are half empty, but the gold is still there, sitting in volcanic rock beneath one of the most famous mountains in America, waiting for someone to ask the right questions about why it was abandoned. And now you know the questions to ask. The real history of Cripple Creek isn't in the textbooks. It's in the flooded tunnels and the rejected subsidy proposals and the geological surveys that nobody talks about anymore. If this video changed how you think about Cripple Creek or about the relationship between government monetary policy and domestic mineral production, check out the video on screen right now. It goes even deeper into the pattern of abandoned infrastructure and sealed resources across the American West. I think you'll find the connections unsettling.